to make a living here. Not everybody's made a Chamath. Not everybody's got SPACs A through Z or had all of their Slack shares bought. I think we'll kick it off with that. Chamath, we saw this week, in fact, just 2 days ago, Salesforce in a record transaction for a SaaS company. I think it's the highest ever paid for a SaaS company, $27 billion, $27.7 billion for Slack, which has only been public for just over a year, I think. Did the Series B in Slack right after they did the pivot at Social Capital. I don't know if that was in Fund 1 or 2, but Phil Hellmuth keeps talking about it.
It was the Series B in Tiny Spec, but it was the Series A in Slack. And there's a really important story, which is that myself and Ray Ko, who's my partner at Social Capital, we've worked together now for, I think it's probably 15 years, wrote a really great memo justifying the investment in Slack. And it had to do with one thing and one thing only. We ignored the revenue and ARR. I mean, it was fine and nice and good. But the single biggest thing that we were attracted to was something that we looked at and which was called intercompany edges. And even back in 2015 or 16, when we did this original investment, there was this dynamic where people across companies were communicating via Slack channels. And I was completely stunned by this idea because that was effectively a substitution for email. Because the only way you communicate across companies today is by email. You know, David is at craftventures.com and he emails me at socialcapital.com and I email Jason at inside.com. That's how we communicate across businesses. Except now, all of a sudden, you could be messaging and having a much more real-time interface. That to me was incredibly disruptive, and it justified the entirety of the real forward-looking investment thesis. Now, fast forward 5 years later, and these guys have more usage on a daily basis than Facebook, which is stunning because, you know, these guys have 10 million DAUs and Facebook has 2 billion. So it just goes to show you the quantity of traffic and the volume of information and theoretically, you know, productivity that's happening on Slack. And so I'm not sure what Salesforce bought. I actually think that, you know, you can make a case why it's a shame that it got bought, a very strong one, in fact. But what they did get, whether they know it or not, is an intercompany edge effect, which is the most disruptive thing to email. And in the hands of Salesforce and that sales team, I think it has the ability to really be a very disruptive force for good in enterprise software.
All right, so Sachs, this is a natural passing of the ball to you and the baton because you did Yammer, sold it to Microsoft for $1 billion, and obviously Slack was the mobile successor to the desktop version of Yammer, and you got a lot of your fingerprints all over this. But the fact is, you did a tweet storm about it. Slack is an unbelievable success. Stuart is a great founder. He sold his first company, Flickr, for $30 million. This one for almost $30 billion, so that's pretty nice. But there was one failure, and you pointed out in your tweet storm. Explain what the one failure, if you could pick out of the hundreds of things, thousands of things they did right. There was one thing they did wrong that, to Chamath's point, would have resulted in them remaining an independent company that could have become worth more than $27 billion.
Yeah, it was a slowness to embrace the idea of enterprise sales. And by the way, let's put this in context. I mean, Stuart and the Slack team did a phenomenal job. $30 billion exit, 7 years of just about flawless execution. So I don't want to, and also, I was an investor in the company. So thank you to Stuart for letting me invest. Definitely don't want to sound like an ingrate or a critic. I mean, they did a phenomenal job. But if you were to nitpick just one little thing that I think they could have done faster, it would have been embracing enterprise sales. The big learning from Yammer, we learned this at Yammer from 2008 to 2012, is that enterprises don't self-serve, right? They don't self-close. Bottom-up SaaS products are phenomenal for generating top of funnel, basically generating leads, but you have to have salespeople close the deals, and enterprises don't just kind of pull out a credit card and self-serve you. They need a salesperson. And I think there was something in the DNA of Slack that actually I see really very commonly in the DNA of sort of producty SaaS companies, producty SaaS founders, which is they kind of have a reflexive dislike or distaste for sales, and they resist the idea of sales, and they want to believe that they can just be entirely product driven. And what I see and across the board is they all come to the same realization that we had at Yammer, which is we have to have a sales team. And I do remember, back in 2014, the whole Yammer sales team was basically rolling off because of, Microsoft acquired the company in 2012, and there was an integration period. And by 2013, 2014, they were all looking for jobs. And I remember, my former CRO, I think, was interviewing at Slack, and it would have been such a perfect thing for them because he had just learned all the lessons of how you layer on kind of an enterprise sale on top of a bottom up product. And they just weren't ready to make that hire yet. And so look, if you're going to nitpick, look, $30 billion outcome, no one's criticizing, but if you were to nitpick, it's an A+ regardless, but this would be the one thing you could say.
Well, congratulations all around to everybody involved, especially Phil Hellmuth, who was an LP in one of Chamath's funds. So if you need insights on Slack or any of the inside information, you can just follow Phil Hellmuth on Twitter at Being the Greatest, or I Am the Greatest, or I'll Always Be the Greatest. One of those Twitter handles is his.
But Jason, I mean, you basically came to the same conclusion in your emergency pod, right? I mean,
I did. I hadn't seen I think your tweet came after the emergency pod, but it just seemed to me this company, unlike Zoom, should have been able to grow quicker. And if you look at their numbers, they had 87 companies that were spending over $1 million. You put a rabid sales team on that product, and they go in like Benioff does with his sales team. I mean, he was just hyper aggressive at just putting huge numbers out there and saying, you have to pay us this much money. So much so that I don't know if you remember Elon getting into a public spat with him where he's like, Salesforce is horrible software, get it out of the organization. And he basically banned it because they came to him with the bottom up people using of Salesforce and said, hey, you owe us this amount of money. And Elon was like, F you, banned forever from inside of our organization. We'll build our own software. We don't need it. And they didn't have somebody, and Stewart didn't have that DNA, I think, to say aggressively, we need to charge what this product is worth. And you saw that in, I think, one of their strengths and weaknesses, which was they only build you for people who were actively using the product. Now, that's a beautiful, awesome feature. It makes you not scared to use it. But on the enterprise level, I mean, that seemed to be like maybe one of those non-cutthroat things that maybe were holding them back. David, you have any insights on this, or should we go on to AlphaFold?
It's really important to remember the mechanics and the game theory around M&A, especially, big game hunting when you're doing $30 billion acquisitions. It's also kind of true at $1 billion levels, but less so. But the bigger the acquisition gets, you have to remember that there's an asymmetry of information between buyers and sellers. And the question is, who does the asymmetry favor? Right? Because you could look at this acquisition and say, wow, Salesforce is crazy for spending $30 billion. And somebody else may say, wow, Slack was really stupid for selling it for $30 billion, right? The reality is that I think that there was asymmetries on both sides. I think that what Slack probably saw, and I don't know because I've been off the board now for more than a year, but I think what they saw was, as David said, just a level of sophistication and scale and ability to cross-sell and upsell that was needed for enterprise scale. Either you overcome it with precision and speed, or you overcome it by going the same pace as somebody like Microsoft, but with an equivalent product portfolio. So that's sort of one realization that Slack had. But in the case of Salesforce, what they probably had was a realization that they couldn't go wall to wall inside of a customer because they didn't really have a product that was useful or usable to every single individual inside of an enterprise. And so both of those two things create asymmetries. There's a level of fear inside of Slack and there's a level of fear inside of Salesforce. Both of them are about the fear of disruption. And then the question is, who gets the better of the other person in the middle of the acquisition, right? So the deal could have probably gotten done at, $22 billion. It probably could have also gotten done at $45 billion. And that's, again, to a combination of how well you play poker in that moment, right? Who blinks first and the quality of the bankers.
This is like two people having top pair on a very textured board. It's like, and they're just raising versus each other.
Yeah, it's who outplays them. Because like it's similar also to like how Microsoft bought LinkedIn, right? Because if you think about what happened in LinkedIn, if you remember when that happened, it was almost to a T, very much like Slack. LinkedIn had one bad quarter. They got decapitated by and I owned it at the time in our public fund. It got decapitated by like 50, 60, 70%. I mean, something insane for missing numbers by like a few pennies. Okay. And all of a sudden, it took a lot of the wind out of their sails internally. It didn't change the user momentum at all because, the users that were signing up for LinkedIn didn't care what the stock price was yesterday, today, and tomorrow. But it all of a sudden created a fear. And I think Microsoft was able to exploit that fear. And within a year, this company was bought for $25 billion. And not dissimilar, Slack had, a hiccup and they got re-rated. The stock bounced back. But I think that if Salesforce was smart, they probably created, sort of like a white knight kind of bid that said, listen, you need enterprise scale and the ability to cross-sell and upsell. I can give it to you. And Slack probably said, listen, you need to go wall to wall. So I understand why you need me. And, the price is what the price is.
Go ahead, Freeberg.
If you look at the pricing, right? So Slack, normally the way these big M&A, public company M&A deals get done is the board has to approve the price and they have to say, this was the right deal for us relative to other options. And one of the ways you assess that is you look at where the share price has been historically. And if you're getting a premium to where the share price has been historically, let's say 30, 40% higher than it's ever been, then the board says, great, that's a good deal. We should take it because we've got a long way to grow into that value. In this case, the deal was done not at a very high premium to where Slack traded just in the summer. Is that right, Chamath? So it looked like it peaked.
It's basically, if you look at
it's a 10% premium, right?
Yeah. 10% premium, yeah.
10% premium, yeah.
We opened the direct listing at 40 or 41, and then this was at 45.
Right. And so there clearly was a sense of weakness from the board, which is, I think, why the Salesforce stock traded down afterwards. Because if they were willing to sell at that small of a premium, the forecast internally is probably feeling not that strong. And then people translate that into, hey, Salesforce bought something that's not that strong. There's something a little bit amiss. But obviously, to your point, they're missing a lot of the cross-selling and the synergy that will arise.
I think it's a huge slam dunk acquisition. And I go back to this idea of intercompany network effects. I think they exist and I think they're real. And I think that the Slack product team's ability to innovate around that was not as fast as it could have been, but it was still very unique. And I think it was a true moat. And the tragedy is we won't see what the terminal value is if they were left alone to execute. And in this weird way, like I've always struggled with why Microsoft was so overly obsessed with Slack, because if you looked at the Teams product, it was much more directly competitive with Zoom. And to this day still remains much more directly competitive with Zoom than Slack. But, there we have it.
And if you look at the revenue, Slack was doing 800 million run rate. So anyway, rounded up to $1 billion. And yet Salesforce at 20 billion. So 5% revenue to revenue. And then they got 10% of the company. So in that way, if you look at it on a percentage basis, which is, how you might look at the Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp, is what percentage of the existing entity did they get?
Right, the Slack's growing about 60% a year, and Salesforce is growing about 22%, something like that.
The other thing is the president of Salesforce is Brett Taylor, who was our CTO at Facebook, who I worked with. And so I think Brett also understands network effects really well. And, by the way, in this interesting twist of fate, Benioff was the underbidder, I think, for LinkedIn. And so, yes. We've seen Mark around the hoop on these, social network effect, business tool acquisitions before, and finally
also Twitter. He was running. Right. He was hanging around the basket with Twitter, right. And then they also brought his name up for TikTok, which made no sense. So I think Benioff is just looking at this like, if Google and Microsoft and Apple are too scared to buy things because of antitrust, well, I'm under the radar of the antitrust $1 trillion, so I'm the only game in town, right?
He's under the radar because he doesn't have a play in this sort of communication or collaboration space, and so therefore there are no antitrust issues. If Microsoft were to do it, it would definitely be scrutinized because you could argue that they're adding to their existing dominant market share in collaboration. But Benioff's dream has always been, at least since he launched Chatter to compete with us when we were doing Yammer. This is back in 2010, 2011, his dream has always been to have a product that could get him onto every seat in the enterprise. His current product set is departmental. I mean, you've got kind of the CRM product for sales, and they've got the support cloud for customer support, and they've got the marketing cloud for marketing. And so he's gone department by department, but he's never really had a sort of sort of cross company. Yeah, something that the entire company would use.
Like a central login system, right?